In early 1940, the Pacific trembled under the weight of Japanese dominance, and the United States Navy struggled to recover from the devastation at Pearl Harbor. Yet behind the closed doors of an unremarkable building at Pearl Harbor, a different kind of battle was unfolding. A group of Navy cryptanalysts at Station HYPO worked day and night in a secret intelligence war that would become one of the most important turning points in World War II. Air warfare and carrier strategy dominated the Pacific, but in these cramped rooms it was pencil, paper, and logic that shaped the coming clash at Midway. Commander Joseph Rockefort led a small team that chipped away at the complex Japanese naval code known as JN-25. This was not glamorous field action, but a grinding intellectual campaign filled with partial intercepts, educated guesses, and cross-analysis that demanded patience and brilliance. Little by little, they identified patterns in Japanese communications. Every breakthrough gave Admiral Chester Nimitz a clearer picture of Imperial Japanese Navy intentions. The codebreakers discovered that a major operation was coming and that its primary objective was a location referred to only as AF. The Japanese believed their code to be unbreakable and expected surprise to secure their victory. The Americans needed confirmation. Rockefort proposed a clever deception. Midway Island was instructed to send an uncoded radio message that its water distillation plant had failed. Shortly after this broadcast, Japanese communications reported that AF was experiencing a water shortage. The trap was sprung. Searchable keywords such as Midway intelligence, Pacific War cryptanalysis, and naval signals analysis fit naturally into this key revelation. Armed with this knowledge, Nimitz understood that the Japanese planned to attack Midway in early June 1942. The American fleet would not stumble into combat by chance. It would lie in wait for the most experienced carrier force in the world. This intelligence triumph transformed what might have been a catastrophic surprise attack into a calculated American ambush. It allowed the United States to position the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown where they could strike with maximum effect. The Battle of Midway would be decided not only by brave aviators, but by the quiet victory won in a room filled with radio intercepts and tireless analysts. In late May 1940, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved confidently across the Pacific, believing that strategic momentum remained firmly in its grasp. Before the United States could rebuild its shattered battleship force, Japan intended to crush American carrier strength and seize Midway at all. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, crafted an elaborate plan intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. This operation relied on simultaneous movements spread across thousands of miles. A diversionary strike would fall on the Aleutian Islands, hoping to draw American forces north. An invasion group aimed for Midway itself prepared to land troops and secure a forward base that threatened Hawaii. And at the heart of the plan sailed the most powerful mobile striking force in the world. Air warfare was evolving rapidly, and Japan believed it led that evolution. Admiral Kiichi Nagamo commanded the carrier strike group that spearheaded Yamamoto's design. His force included the celebrated carriers Akagi, Kaga, Suryu, and Hiryu, along with experienced air groups seasoned by victories across Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean Raid. These crews were among the finest naval aviators in existence. Their confidence was bolstered by a string of early war triumphs as Japanese naval power reached its peak. Searchable keywords such as Pacific Fleet Strategy, Japanese Naval Aviation, Yamamoto Midway Invasion Force, and Carrier Task Force help identify the historic context. Japan expected that American morale would be shaken and American carriers would rush to defend Midway, where they could be destroyed by superior Japanese coordination. Yamamoto's design, however, was extraordinarily complex and relied on perfect timing. Even small delays or unexpected enemy movements could unravel the plan. Crucially, Japan did not know that American cryptanalysts had already exposed the operation. The Japanese believed they were the hunters approaching an unsuspecting foe. Instead, the Americans were already positioned east of Midway with Enterprise, Hornet, and the rapidly repaired Yorktown hidden beyond the horizon. Instead of springing a trap, Japan sailed directly into one. As the Japanese armada approached, it subjected the elements of Yamamoto's design appeared flawless on paper. Yet the fog of war, the limits of reconnaissance, and the unseen presence of American carriers waiting in silence would turn the coming hours into a decisive moment in the Pacific War. The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned with an air of tense anticipation. High above the Pacific, the skies were soon filled with the roar of aircraft engines as the U.S. Navy's carriers launched their planes toward the Japanese fleet. The Battle of Midway was about to unfold, and the fate of the Pacific hung in the balance. For the American forces, it was a test of courage, coordination, and endurance. The crews of the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the freshly repaired USS Yorktown prepared to carry out a daring counterstrike with limited information and even fewer resources. The Americans knew they were outnumbered, but they also had something that the Japanese didn't: the element of surprise. As the attack began, the American squadrons faced the brutal challenges of warfare at sea. The first wave of torpedo bombers consisting of pilots from both the Enterprise and Hornet launched their assault on the Japanese fleet. These were high-risk missions. The torpedo bombers had to fly directly into the teeth of enemy defenses, knowing that the Japanese carriers were protected by formidable combat air patrols. The mission was doomed to failure from the outset, yet the torpedo squadrons sacrificed themselves without hesitation. The Japanese fighters scrambled to intercept the attackers, drawing their attention away from the real threat. In a testament to their bravery, many American pilots flew directly into enemy fire, most never to return. But their selfless sacrifice opened a critical window. By the time the last of the torpedo bombers had plunged into the sea, American dive bombers, led by pilots from the Enterprise, were climbing to their attack altitude. Their mission was not to strike the carriers directly, but to exploit the opening created by the torpedo bombers' assault. As the squadron scoured the vast Pacific for their target, the tension was unbearable. Would they find the Japanese fleet before fuel ran low? Could they complete the mission before the Japanese were able to regroup? At this moment in history, fate seemed to rest on a knife's edge. The battle was far from over, and the Americans were already enduring mounting losses. But this was not the end, it was only the beginning. The coordination between the different strike groups would ultimately decide the battle's outcome, but the situation remained perilous. The next hours would be decisive. Searchable keywords such as American dive bombers, torpedo bombers, naval strike coordination, and Midway carrier tactics give insight into the specific operational actions taken during this critical stage. The moment of reckoning came in the late morning of June 4th, 1942, as the American dive bombers approached their target. The Japanese fleet was caught in a vulnerable position. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each the pride of Japan's naval power, were busy rearming and refueling their aircraft. They were preparing for a second wave of strikes, but they had no idea that American bombers were already closing in from high above. The carriers were in the midst of preparing for their next attack, their decks cluttered with planes being readied for combat. This was the moment the American pilots had been waiting for. With precision and deadly timing, the U.S. Navy's dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown descended from the clouds like a sudden storm. They dove at nearly a 70-degree angle, their bombs timed to hit with catastrophic force. The Japanese carriers, unprotected by the swift and well-coordinated anti-aircraft fire they had relied on during previous battles, were at their most vulnerable. The first bomb hit Akagi, causing massive damage and setting off a deadly chain reaction. A few moments later, Kaga was struck by multiple bombs, causing explosions that tore through its hull. Soryu, already battered by the earlier torpedo bombers, was similarly devastated by dive bombers. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's foremost formidable carriers were burning wrecks on the Pacific Ocean, their once proud flight decks in ruins. But the battle was not yet over. The Japanese still had Hiryu, the last remaining carrier, which was quick to retaliate. Hiryu launched counterstrikes against the American carriers, with deadly results. The Yorktown was hit by a bomb, and fires began to spread throughout the ship. However, the American response was swift. The dive bombers, ever vigilant, located Hear You later that afternoon and launched their own strikes. With surgical precision, they struck Hear You with bombs that ignited fires and crippled the ship beyond repair. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost their entire carrier force, the cornerstone of their naval power. For carriers, the heart of Japan's fleet, had been destroyed in a single day. The impact was profound. This loss shattered Japan's ability to project naval power across the Pacific and changed the course of the war. For the United States, the victory at Midway marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Pacific theater, a shift in momentum that would eventually lead to Japan's defeat. The destruction of Japan's elite carrier force at Midway not only crippled their fleet, but also shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. Midway was no longer just a battle, it was a decisive turning point that would echo through history. The Americans had achieved the impossible, a counterstrike that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific and set the stage for the eventual Allied victory in World War II. Midway would forever be remembered as one of the most decisive battles in naval history. Keywords such as carrier destruction, Pacific War turning point, Hear You, Midway counterstrike, and Japanese naval defeat capture the importance of this final, devastating blow.